Hello, and welcome to Redgate's Advocate Playlist. Today, I am chatting with Chris Unwin, and we are talking about a solution that we are looking at in a prototype for a really interesting customer pattern that we've been thinking about lately. My name is Kendra Little, and I am on Redgate's Advocate team. And what we do is we think about the best way that people can design, source control, and deploy database changes. And this is, I think, just a really cool pattern. So, Chris, this pattern involves wanting to deploy on a schema basis, right?
Yes, exactly. So let's do a bit of background here. So we've been chatting about a scenario where a customer of ours might want to host multiple databases for their respective customers. But of course, depending on what that customer has access to, kind of like in terms of ERP modules, they receive certain schemas based on what products or services they consume from our hypothetical customer. And the idea here is that whilst they all might have some consistent base objects, say, existing in the DBO schema, they might also have their own specific schemas or a set of schemas that are perhaps shared between them. So customers 1, 3, and 7 may receive the A schema. Customers 2, 4, and 9 might get the B schema. How exactly do you break that workflow down and make sure that you're able to take only the appropriate changes to the appropriate schemas and deliver them in a consistent way without having a gazillion different projects and maintaining 20 different versions of the same database in source control?
Yeah.
Source control is obviously supposed to be our one single source of truth.
Yeah, code should be reusable. So at the heart of this, even if you have a different pattern, there might be some bits of your code that you would like to put in its own schema and make it reusable across a bunch of different databases. Maybe code that does event logging or code that does some other functionality that's shared all across your different environment. You shouldn't put that in source control in every single database and then have to update it in every single database. So this is, I think, exactly, a really useful pattern.
Brilliant.
And there's a variety of ways of doing this. The question from our customer was, what is the most efficient and fastest way to deliver this? And that was the heart of the challenge that we were thinking about, is if you want this to deploy as fast as possible, how could you set this up?
Well, it's interesting because you've got two ways of thinking about it, right? And the first way of thinking about it is, do we go state or do we go migrations? Because what we would normally associate with state is the slowness, which is related to this second hypothetical thing over here. So leave that over there. But the primary difference is if people are wanting to work significantly faster, then we would associate that potentially with this kind of smaller, more incremental process associated with migrations, because we know exactly what we're going to deploy and it's all just being packaged up and neatly deployed. It's just very, very swift, very straight through. That makes perfect sense. But again, that doesn't really help when we want to make sure that source control is our one source of truth, because the migration scripts that we generate might touch multiple different schemas and it's going to be hard to split those out and make sure they only deploy against the right environments. That's a real headache. So for this point in time, we're going to be looking at state. Makes sense.
And in this case, the person asking the question, their team was already working well in state. They're already comfortable in state. So if there's a good way to do this in state, and the secret, if you're not so familiar with the language we're using, the secret behind this is with the state-based approach, with these deployments, every time you deploy, what you've stored in source control is all your object definitions. So for a table, it's got all the columns, all their data types, their nullability properties, their indexes, their constraints, everything about that table. And then at deployment time, the engine says, I'm going to compare what's in that database with what's in source control, and I'm going to automatically generate a way to make it match. So you can do that at a schema-based level. But if I have, say, 50 production databases, all of which have a mix of these different schemas in it, and I'm doing a compare for every schema in every database at the time of deployment, that is a lot of compares to run every single time. And so the challenge
Absolutely.
put to us was, well, how is there a way to make this faster? And it was actually Chris who came up with the heart of this idea of how to make it faster. And I think when I think about this, I think there's kind of two parts to the solution. And this is all talking about how the Redgate tooling works with SQL Source Control.
Mm-hmm.
With SQL Source Control, using SQL Change Automation for deployment,
mm-hmm.
part one of the secret is that what we call release artifacts are reusable. And so when you do that comparison of saying, hey, what code am I going to deploy? You create a release artifact that has the exact code that's going to be deployed. And the other part of the solution is that filters can be used. Deployment filters can be used when you create that release artifact. And they say, okay, I'm only going to consider, in this case, a specific schema, and I'll only put the update code for that schema into the release artifact. So you can combine these to create reusable artifacts that can be used for all your targets. Instead of having to, you don't have to generate the comparison for each and every database you're running against.
Exactly. And this is the pinch point, is that we were being told that this two-step process of create the release artifact and then deploy the release artifact, that was too slow. So they did already have these processes in place, and how do we speed this up, make this process even easier? And actually, I think it occurred to us that the comparison, well, that is going to happen multiple times, but that doesn't need to happen every single time we release the artifact, because if we've got an artifact that only contains the reusable code for that schema, then we just have to recycle and reuse that particular deployment artifact. But it doesn't answer the question, when is that deployment artifact being generated, or when are those deployment artifacts being generated? So it actually moved it slightly earlier in the cycle, and Kendra's fantastic idea as well was to have almost like a golden copy, right?
Oh, well, I think I picked up this terminology from another customer who refers to something as a golden database. And the golden database is a non-production database that sort of represents the state of production. It may not be a restored backup of production, but the schema is a golden copy that reflects the state of a customer. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I learned almost everything from customers and colleagues.
Well, we were talking about this recently on an episode of DBL. One of my customers used the term turquoise deployment, and Ryan Rousseau from Octopus was trying to figure out what that one meant. Instead of blue-green, they had turquoise. So
I've always called it aqua because I got that from Michael J. Swart online, but I like turquoise is a little flashier than aqua.
Exactly. Oh yes, we're practicing turquoise deployments. Biscuit. In any case, so I think the workflow we settled on was devs make changes in dev, no change there, submitting their changes through SQL Source Control into their Git repository or repository of choice. Of course, it could be any. This model will work with any kind of repository. It's key to note. And then the build stage happens again exactly the same, because we want to make sure that the build stage is one of the most important stages, given the level of testing and validation, the feedback loops that it gives us to ensure that the database is going to work together holistically, the whole thing working together. Does that make sense? Does it build okay? That bit shouldn't be changed. Now, once we have the release artifact, that NuGet package, of course, for anyone not familiar, basically a lovely, wonderful zip file containing everything that we're going to need to deploy. We take that NuGet package and then push it across to our release manager of choice, where we can then do two things. One, create all of the necessary release artifacts for each different schema, and then release only the necessary artifacts by reusing the most recent of those artifacts for those schemas against the affected databases.
Yeah. So I have the code to update schema A, and I can just run that against every single database that has schema A.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So should we jump in? I'll show you what I've put together. So I spent, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So I spent a good portion of last week putting together an example of this. So here you'll see SSMS on my Azure virtual machine. Now, unfortunately, I have just a couple of Azure credits, so Azure bucks. So my VM is basically steam powered at this point, made out of bamboo. It chugs along quite merrily. I can't have SSMS open and also Google Chrome, because otherwise you start to see real performance degradation. So that just lets you know what tier I'm on. In any case, though, you'll notice that I have a set of databases. Now, again, I'm not flashy enough to have multiple VMs for this, so my apologies. Put them all on the same one. Perfectly fine for testing. And as you'll see here, I've got two development databases. So I've got I have many schemas dev Chris and I have many schemas dev Kendra.
I'm so proud of my many schemas.
And these are both linked to a Git repository hosted in Azure DevOps. Let me just grab Azure DevOps. There we go. So the Azure DevOps we've got here is filter-based deployment. If we jump over into the repos, you'll notice that we have our state-based files there. Now, if I jump back in and have a quick look, so we're familiar with the intricate and extremely complicated nature of my databases, you'll notice that I do indeed have 4 distinct schemas. I have the DBO schema. I then have the beep schema, the derp schema, and the doink schema.
This is good naming. Yeah, I like this. Naming is the hardest part of software development, and you have mastered it.
Thank you. I stole beep from you, but derp and doink just kind of naturally followed afterwards. Now, I actually did this using SQL clone because I couldn't be bothered to keep replicating the database. So I just created I have many schemas production and then pulled that out and created dev Chris, dev Kendra, also an empty one that I haven't used yet, but I'm thinking of putting in additional steps in my pipeline to create a full-on release artifact to deploy from scratch. Not there yet, but I do have this gold copy as well. I have many schemas gold, which is exactly the same as those dev ones in that it has all 4 of the primary schemas and the necessary objects, the primary and secondary tables I've created. And then we have the hypothetical customer databases. I do also have an I have many schemas production database, and this is purely a testing step as well. And this is kind of a match with gold, but the release artifacts are built against gold, and then they are deployed against gold, and then also to test the reusable nature of those scripts, of those update artifacts, they're then also deployed against production. Yeah. So it's just a kind of a twofold.
And that also proves that deploying one release artifact doesn't get rid of all the other schemas, right? Because exactly. With a state-based solution, you do have to be careful that you're deploying in a way that you don't accidentally make everything just match what you're deploying and then wipe out everything else. So this is proving that the way this deployment filter is setting up is going to ignore everything outside that schema.
Oh, absolutely. But then you have our 3 customer databases. So we have, I have many schemas prod beep, which has beep.primary table and dbo.primary table. If we look at derp, we can see we've got dbo and derp.
Yeah.
And if we look at doink, just to make sure that I'm not trying to sneak anything past you, dbo and doink.
Yeah, cool.
Now, when we have committed our changes, I'm, like I said, using a Git repository in Azure DevOps. So we have these 2 databases for the devs, that's us. And once we've gone ahead and committed our changes and pushed them to my Azure DevOps repo, you also see that I've got my lovely Azure Pipelines YAML file there. So naturally, that would indicate that we are then building. So I cancelled the last run of this purely because I just made a few admin changes and it just runs for some reason automatically when I make changes, which is very helpful. But if I take a quick look at what happens in the pipeline, how do you feel about YAML, Kendra? You're
Um, they're always like, you should use YAML. And I'm like, there's that button where I can use the legacy GUI, and I choose that button. So tell me about this YAML.
So I actually was a bit of a YAML newbie when going into this. And I thought, you know what, I'm used to that classic view one gets with Azure DevOps Server or the on-premise version. And I thought, you know what, let's give it a go. Let's see how it goes. And
All right,
actually,
maybe you'll inspire me.
it's remarkably straightforward. It's so easy to use because you build your starter pipeline and you can choose to put in your own task. And as you can see, they're very logically built. So at the moment, I'm making sure I'm using the embedded version of Octopus Deploy. So I've got Octopus Deploy, which I'm going to use for releasing. For now, we're going to do the building in Azure DevOps.
So to get that in there, did you just on the right in the tasks? I'm asking because I literally don't know how did you have to write that code by hand?
So you don't have to write that code by hand. What you do is you just find obviously a new line because this is within your task. So you picking up what the trigger is. So I have a trigger on my master branch. I then have a pool. So you pick a pool as to what it's going to build against. So I believe the default is Ubuntu. The latest Ubuntu. So I changed that to Windows latest.
Okay, so that's similar to what I do in the GUI, so I get it. Yeah.
Yep. And then once you've got that, where it says steps, all you then have to do is go and put your steps in. So here, all you do is then choose a task on the right-hand side, and that could be anything from running a command line executable to, of course, picking up Redgate SQL Change Automation build.
Y'all, Chris didn't know he was basically giving me an introduction to YAML in this session, but this is so much easier than I thought it was going to be.
Oh, it's so super easy.
I thought I had to type it all in.
Well, the benefit to this is once you've added the task, you'll notice that where it says settings on each one of these tasks, there's no line.
Yeah.
So if you click on that, it will actually open up all of those sets on the right-hand side. Who would have thunk?
Okay. My life has changed. Chris is teaching me all sorts of stuff because I'm also getting an introduction to Octopus Deploy in this session.
Now, the good thing is, once we've built up our prerequisites, so here you can see our output NuGet package ID is beep beep. And then we've got the build of the SQL Source Control project. Database scripts folder is in VCS root, which it is for me. Obviously, it might be in a subfolder for everyone else out there who doesn't have a garbage setup like me. But then what we're doing is I'm just copying the build, the NuGet package. I'm taking that build artifact and copying it across to the staging directory. And then we are publishing that. And by publishing, we mean we are sharing that build artifact, making it available to whatever release management tool we want to use. Now, fortunately, there are a bunch of Octopus Deploy plugins for Azure DevOps as well. So here we've got the publishing to Octopus Deploy, but then we also have some additional steps. So Octopus has its own push, so it can actually take the published artifact and basically push it over to where your Octopus server is. And then you can actually use tasks in Azure DevOps to power your pipeline as well. So here we've got Octopus create release. So it will actually create a new release on the receiving of a new NuGet package. Now in Octopus Deploy, a new release is just a new instance of that part of the pipeline. So we might create release 0.007, for instance. And then each time we do that, it creates a new release, which then gets pushed out to target environments.
So it's a build that could be deployed.
Yes, exactly. And then once you've done that, we actually then just go ahead and release it. So here I've got my primary project, and all we're doing is basically pushing out. You can create a release, that's fine, but nothing actually gets triggered. Nothing actually starts to deploy. We've just created a new deployment. So what this step here will do is actually kick off the deployment against my first kind of primary steps, in this case, pre-production. I promise it will make more sense in just a
Okay.
couple of minutes.
Okay. Yeah. I'm a little lost here. Also, so how did you get the list? How did you know what series to do these steps in?
So I didn't, if I'm
Oh,
honest. So I knew that I needed a package, and I knew I needed it to be an Octopus Deploy.
yeah.
That's all I knew. So I started off by basically saying, okay, well, I started failing on the build immediately because I was using Ubuntu latest, and I don't want Ubuntu, I want Windows. So changed the VM image to Windows latest, and then put in the Redgate Change Automation build, which just worked like a dream. It was ingeniously simple. It just happened. And then I was trying to publish the artifact. And the problem with this was it wasn't in the right directory. So I was getting a build error saying I can't publish it because the directory is empty.
Yeah.
So just a bit of Googling later, I found you could copy and publish the artifact just using copy and publish steps in Azure DevOps.
I was hoping there was a helpful article somewhere. It sounds like you had to do some trial and error on it. Okay.
A little bit of trial and error. 25 failed builds later, we have a working pipeline. So that's what matters.
We can create an article. So I'll make a little note for myself that maybe this is something we could articleize and review with the Octopus folks. I have a feeling this will help other people too. Okay. Show me more.
Fabulous. So once we've then published that build artifact, then it was very, very straightforward because Octopus Deploy have got fabulous documentation as well using the Octopus plugins for Azure DevOps, which actually tell you what order to do these steps in, how to configure them. It's very, very straightforward. So I was able, because the output of the Redgate build step is a NuGet package anyway, I didn't have to use Octopack or anything like that to actually put it into a NuGet package. And then we just and then you just push it on over to Azure DevOps.
All right.
Yeah. Got to make sure I'm heavily caffeinated.
It's only right.
Absolutely. So once you've gone ahead and published that, and Azure DevOps has told Octopus to create the release for you, what happens is, ta-da! And can we just take a minute, please, to appreciate the lovely, shiny, dark theme that has been introduced in Octopus? How beautiful is this? It's tremendous.
I like how it's a little aquatic, which really, it's perfect. Yeah.
Well, needless to say that in Octopus...
some excitement here about it.
Very excited.
Big fans of the dark theme.
So the benefit to using Octopus is that it's very easy to guess what the naming conventions are going to be. They make reference to tentacles. There's calamari in there. Yeah, let's not even get into all of that. But it actually turns out it's quite easy to get up and running with Octopus. And I just jumped onto the free tier, and the good thing is I think it's up to 10 deployments, like targets you can actually have for free. So it's basically free for small teams, which is incredible and amazing by Octopus. So I was able to get up and running really easily, and it works on a similar principle to other deployment systems, in the sense that you need something to carry out the deployment on that machine. Mm-hmm. So on my I have many schemas host VM, I do also have the Octopus tentacle, which there it is, the Octopus tentacle manager. So in here, you actually then basically configure either a polling or a listening tentacle, and basically that goes off and says, right, I'm going to deploy whatever it is you need deployed.
Cool. Okay. So that's like Azure DevOps has an agent that it uses to do deploys. This is kind of similar to that.
Yeah, exactly. You have the tentacle notion. Now, the process in Octopus had me scratching my head for a little bit, because instead of doing it almost instead of it being purely procedural and you saying, right, do this, then do this, then do this, what you do is you create a list of deployment steps in what order they're supposed to happen, and then you add basically which environments they're relevant for.
Oh, interesting.
So
Okay.
you might always do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but when you get to step 6, that might only execute for pre-production or for
I
staging.
I love that.
It's really cool.
That is based on real world needs of everything seems like it would be the same for every environment, but actually no.
Exactly. And this is the perfect use case for this. And Octopus has this covered really, really nicely. It's a very elegant workflow. So basically, my job was made a whole lot easier through the fact that obviously SQL Change Automation build and deployment steps are plugins for both Azure DevOps for the build and for Octopus Deploy for the deploy. So makes things significantly easier for me. So I installed the Redgate plugin into Octopus Deploy and then just started putting together the pipeline. And there's a first step, which is where basically the NuGet package that's been captured for this process needs to be pushed to the location where you're deploying so that that can happen locally. So the NuGet package that's now been received by Octopus from Azure DevOps now goes down to the client machine, in my case, my DM prod VM. Now, once that package has been received by that tentacle, it's then able to execute the rest of the processes. So in this case, it creates a database release. So everyone will remember those two steps. We've got the create database release, and then we've got the release from database deployment artifact.
Yeah, and all the thinking is done in create database release. The execute is just, I'll take that script, I'll run it, and I'll record that I ran it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the good thing here is that you can choose exactly what roles certain targets are in. You can choose the target instance. And here I was able to hard code the I have many schemas gold database because I needed it hard coded. But the thing is that when it actually gets up to deployment time, there are a ton of really useful variables that you can use in Octopus Deploy as well, which actually mean that you just say, okay, look at the deployment environment name and append that. So in my case, it's I have many schemas prod beep. So the environment is called prod beep in Octopus. So I was able to reuse the same step. So each time it just looks at prod beep, prod derp, prod doink. So
very, very cool.
So we build the artifact for everything.
Yeah.
Then we do the same step again. So we create a database release, and this time it's for DBO. Then we do basically what's happening here is a little bit of magic, which is those basically the filters that you referenced earlier. So here you can see we've got this C Octopus filters DBO filter. Now, if I jump over into my VM and actually have a look at that folder location, so you can see how many times I've run this pipeline. Look at all the change reports. So it was C Octopus filters. So I've just created a handy dandy folder in my C Octopus directory with each of the filters that I'm going to be required to run. And to create a filter is the easiest thing in the world.
I don't know. There are easier things, but it's pretty easy.
I can't think of much easier, if I'm honest. Nope, no, this is the easiest thing.
Drinking coffee is easier.
Oh, actually, that's a good point. Yeah, that is pretty easy.
Yeah. It's almost as easy as drinking coffee.
It is almost as easy as drinking coffee because all you have to do is go into SQL Compare, and you can either take a pre-made one that you've already got and you can pull that into Compare and have a look at that, or I can actually use, let's do a database-to-database comparison. So if I use the local server, for instance, and we take a look at I have many schemas dev Chris, and I have many schemas prod doink. Now, dev Chris obviously has all of the schemas in. So I'm going to hit compare now, and it should pick up quite rightly that we only have only have doink in the target, and it will basically say I need to deploy all of these objects to the target. Again, this is all based around my VM being very, very slow. Compare's making the best of what it's got. There we go. Cool. So let's remind me next week. Too many updates, Compare team, honestly. Stop being so productive.
DevOps.
DevOps, exactly. So you can see here in the comparison output that we have one in both but different. That's the doink primary table. And then we've got the beep and derp objects that also exist in my source that don't exist in my target but shouldn't exist in my target. Now I can actually create a filter. So up here you can see we've got all the object types included, and we can customize those filter rules and say include only if the schema name begins with doink. We hit OK, and that's it. That's it. And then you just save. You hit the little the little floppy disk icon for anyone who's forgotten what a floppy disk is. You hit the save icon and you have your SCPF file, or your SQL Compare filter file.
Can you expand the 26 identical? So this is a little quirk that I noticed. Notice that the schema name, so the only object that's being scripted is that doink primary table, but notice that the some of the beep schema is in there. So see how beep equals beep? The schema itself is in there. So you can choose to do this either way. You could choose, it's just whether it's going to actually create this schema itself. If you want to filter out not just the objects in the schema, but also the schema itself, you have to put an additional filter on the schema thing.
Yes.
So you can click on schema and do that. So that's just a choice you have as to whether you want the schema to be in the target or not. That's why it's not quite as easy as drinking coffee. You may just
this is true.
But always, and that's, I think, is a good tip with Compare, is when you're working with filters, just always examine what's identical as well.
True. That makes perfect sense. And see if you can find any beeps, derps, or doinks. So once you've got your filter file, put it in a nice handy dandy location where the, so this is going to be where the gold database is effectively. This is going to be where we're building the release artifact. So that is then going to lead us on to, basically, if we jump back into Octopus, you can see that we've specified that filter, and we actually do this a number of times. And they're similar, but we just do each schema once. So DBO, then we have beep, then we do derp, then we do doink.
Mm-hmm.
That's all we do. So then what we do is we deploy to our gold schema, and this is actually releasing all changes to gold to bring it now up to date. And then that's only testing that one package. Now we've got to test each of the other deployment artifacts. So what we do is we then have a deploy to production step, and then a deploy DBO, beep, derp, and doink steps. And all this is doing, if we jump into, say, deploy beep, all this is doing is just, if Octopus catches up with me, there we go. All it's then doing is it's looking at the path where the artifact was exported, in this case, C Octopus artifacts beep.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's going to deploy that to the relevant environment. So in this case, it's going to, because I've only targeted, where is it? There it is. This step will only run in prod beep.
So you could create you could create an environment for every database that should have that schema in it.
Yes,
Is
exactly.
that it?
Yeah.
Cool.
So if I had, say, prod beep 2, and I wanted to also deploy the beep artifact, all I would do is pop that environment in here as well. And that really adds to the scalability of this as well, is that, oh, you've come on, gentle customer. Well, here's the initial deployment that we might do using our empty comparison if we ever do anything with that. Mm-hmm. Or we can just do a straight up SQL compare. Boom, there you go. You've got the latest version of the database. However we want to do that deployment. And ultimately what this means is that once they're then onboarded, we just add them into the relevant schemas and away you go.
Yeah. Okay. So I love that this can be done in 12 steps. This is 12-step program. But you're able to manage different combinations by simplifying things using environments. You don't have to have like a step for every combination. Yeah, that is
exactly
very slick.
And you can see that Octopus environment name there.
Yeah.
Now, if I jump back to the overview, I've actually, obviously, as we know, the longest part of this is actually the creating of the artifacts. So I recently made some changes. That is yesterday morning, I made some changes and I pushed them out. And if we see what happens is, it then goes through those pre-prod steps. We can see we've got create database release for all changes, DBO schema, beep, derp, and doink. Then the deploy to gold. And that's basically everything that we need in pre-prod to generate all of our artifacts and bring gold now up to scratch as it should be. Once we've done that, if we jump back again, we then have the release to production step, which then takes the artifact and deploys that now to production. And then if we jump back to releases, oh no, not that one, overview again, we then have the steps to deploy to beep, derp, and doink. Now, just before we do that, let's have a quick look at our deployment artifacts. So here's the artifacts. Sorry?
I love a good artifact.
I'm starting to feel like an artifact. Stuck in the house. I feel like I'm just waiting for someone to discover me. So we've got the various different schemas here. So all beep, DBO, derp, and doink. And if we take a look at beep, projects 1, there's 0.07, and that's the most recent create we had of this particular artifact. And if we take a look, there's that good old-fashioned report. That's not old-fashioned, it's new-fashioned, but the same changes.html report that we are used to and love. Of course, if we open up that artifact, what we should see is that we have an amalgamation of the changes that should be deployed to beep only. So that is beep poorly named proc. As we can see here, we've got a select star from beep.primary table.
Nice select star.
Select star, thank you, thank you. We can see though, fortunately, Change Automation has picked this up for us and said, don't do that, that's bad.
We've all got issues.
Yeah, but some of them aren't as bad as an asterisk in my procedure select list.
Just a warning, it's not an error.
It's a feature, not a bug. And then what we've got here is only the code. So the script here has been generated purely to update that schema. So select star from beep.primary table. We can see that we've got all of the other lovely compare logic around it, wrapping it in a transaction, etc., etc.
Yeah, and I don't see commands to drop things in other schemas.
Exactly.
Because of that deployment filter.
Because of that wonderful filter.
Yeah.
So the good thing is, now that we've built those artifacts, all we then have to do is, of course, I can jump into Octopus. Actually, I tell you what, let's make sure that SSMS isn't running because, like I said, my VM is... There we go. SSMS is now closed. Everything is closed. So hopefully we should be able to just hit deploy to prod beep. You can see exactly which environments it's going to be deployed to, what the current version is, what the new version is, how many steps are in the deployment, if there are any excluded steps, when the deployment's going to happen. You get all of this customizability. Thank you, Octopus Deploy.
Yeah, we don't actually sell Octopus Deploy. This just looks really cool.
It does look really cool. And all I do is I hit deploy, and then there we go. It actually just kicks off the process. And you can see that it's just making sure it's got the packages, it's double checking. Do I need to download the package, or is there a package already existing? Nope, we're all good. The package already exists. Then we've got the deploy package. So all this is going to do is it's going to now deploy just DBO and beep, because of course, we actually have to do both. So step 9 to deploy DBO is actually going to happen against every single environment.
Right.
And then step 10 is just deploying beep.
Yeah, so that is something to be aware of if you set things up like this, is it needs to be okay for one schema to be updated across them all before the next one is. I mean,
Yes.
Things are going to have to be done in one order or another. You just need to understand the order.
Yeah, exactly. And you do have task histories as well. So you can actually see previous deployments. So here you can see when we did 0.06, we can see all the changes. So it actually pulls over some of the comments that we had in our commits and our pull requests as well. We can see the specific jobs that ran as well. So you can actually see all of the different lines. So our deploy DBO typically takes almost 2 minutes or so.
But I noticed that when you were looking at the create release artifact, that said it had taken 11 minutes, because that was the part that creating the artifacts is the part that has to think about what code to generate on your tiny little VM.
Yes, exactly. So
the little VM that could.
It thinks it can. So the benefit here is that we're saving. Well, I mean, if we've got 3 environments, right, and let's say we've got 10 environments. Let's make this super simple. Okay, so we've got 10 environments. Against those at the moment, we're having to do a create and a deploy. Now, the deploy is always going to take about 2-3 minutes. We're accepting of that. It makes sense. But the comparison is going to take between 10 and 12 minutes. For simplicity, if we just say it's going to take 10 minutes, and we have 10 environments, that's 100 minutes worth of comparison, when actually it could just happen a little bit earlier and we don't have to worry about it affecting any of those deployments.
And if you are using a more significant infrastructure, you could see faster comparison time, right? If you've got faster CPUs and more of them. But if you're deploying to 50 databases or 100 databases, right? And I have seen people say, yeah, we have one customer per database, so we have an environment with thousands of databases that we need to deploy to. Then thinking about patterns like this can really help streamline that deployment process a lot.
Exactly. And in just a couple of minutes, we should see that the deploy of beep, this is how you know when you've done this too many times, is you recognize how many lines have been output from the deployment process, and you start going, oh yeah, that's almost done. So we're at 521 lines. But if we scroll right down, you can see that it's now carrying out the deployment against the target environment. So applying the upgrade script, that's now run successfully. This should now update. It's applying the retention policy on the tentacle.
I actually think that part of your deployment time may just be that it's using verbose.
Yeah, that was my bad.
Well, for testing and for setup, that's what you want to do. But yeah,
absolutely. I want to see every single step.
On a small scale deployment or machine where one thing's doing it all, I actually think you might see faster time if you remove the verbose.
Well, the good thing is we've now got prod beep on 0.07. And of course, if we now jump over into our VM, now we can fire up SSMS. Now that process has ended. Need some Azure credit. Come on, Microsoft. Help a Chris out.
Azure's in very high demand these days. So,
True. But if we now jump in, we should be able to see that I've now only deployed beep.poorly named sprock, and we haven't actually deployed any of the other schema objects. So we should only have beep and no derp, no doink. DBO, of course, should be there as well. So let's have a look. I have many schemas prod beep. We've still only got beep and DBO. And there we go. There's poorly named proc. All deployed, all happy.
So that's super cool. Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for showing this. So I've learned today, YAML, not nearly as scary as I thought it was.
Yep.
Octopus Deploy, totally something I'm going to learn soon. That's actually been on my list for a long time to learn more about Octopus Deploy and get out of there. And now I'm like, it's before you've actually kind of gone into something, you're like, I have no idea. Now I feel like it's friendly and doable, and it has
absolutely it is.
And also The main patterns that we were discussing have to do with the fact that once you create a release artifact, you can reuse it. And deployment filters can help you limit the code that's in that release artifact, that if you want to deploy something to a database that contains other objects and ignore them, that is one way that you can just generate some update scripts for bits of reusable code that are perhaps confined in a schema and not the only code in the target database.
Exactamundo.
Love it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for your time,
sometime.
Kendra. We'll definitely have to do this again sometime. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the time of anyone watching. Hello out there. And of course, as always, do you want to finish us off, Kendra? If anyone has any questions about this process, if anyone wants to get in touch with you or I or the other wonderful smart people at Redgate, where do they go?
Where do they go? Where do they go? So one thing I always recommend is if there's something you want in a product, email us at sales@redgate.com. You don't even have to be an existing customer. Sales@redgate.com. Say, I wish X. They will help make sure your thing gets to the right place. I am on Twitter at Kendra_little. Chris, you are on Twitter at plant-based SQL. There's no punctuation in there, right?
Nope, not at all. It's camel case, plant-based SQL.
Yeah, and you can also reach us at firstname.lastname@redgate.com. That generally works.
Absolutely. For now, though, thank you very much, Kendra. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, bye, y'all.
Bye.